So as you know, that today we have Cameron, and he's the person that I know who's has the most expertise in flow. I don't know if I know of many people who know more about flow than Cam. And Cam's also responsible for a lot of inspiration for me personally from a coaching perspective. And if you haven't already, definitely check out the Flow Center because they do some really good stuff in the teaching, learning, coaching, education space around flow. And Cam's great to chat to because he's not only interested in flow from like a performance, like get results perspective, but also like from a way of life. And he totally embodies that in how he lives, and spends a lot of time in flow. So great to have you here, Cam.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, so I think the general structure will just be I'll ask a bunch of questions and we'll have a chat. And if anyone has got a question, they can just raise their hand or put something in the chat box at any moment. And then also I'll leave some time at the end for questions as well. Cool. All right. So I think it would be nice, Cam, if you could just let us know like how you personally got into flow. Like why flow? Because you've built your whole life around it now at this point.
Yeah, it's absorbed me into a vortex of flow. So I used to be a junior tennis player playing tennis for England, and it was my life, my direction, my everything. And I got injured and couldn't play tennis and got a bit depressed, and meaning had kind of left me, and my strength had left me, and I was kind of left with a not a directionless, but I didn't have the same impetus as I had before. And I remember backpacking in Peru, in Cuzco, and walking up a street and seeing this busker who was completely immersed in the music. Could have been playing in the Royal Opera House or the Albert Hall, and he was playing like a prince and completely absorbed in every single note, to the extent that I couldn't help but be completely transfixed. And I was kind of walking up a little bit fatigued and altitude sickness, and just kind of slowly waking up. But then my whole subjective experience just flip-flopped into this magical note and tune and music, and I was kind of lost as the busker was lost. And that for me was really impactful for a number of reasons. One, I realized that the busker was actually, he had 2 amputated arms and he was playing the harmonica with 2 stubs. And I thought, wow, here was me in sort of self-pity and depressed because I couldn't play tennis, but I still had 2 arms. And here is this person able to find their magic when in their condition. Secondly, I thought that's what I missed from tennis. It wasn't hitting 1,000 tennis balls and living out of a suitcase. It was those moments where you would lose yourself in the moment. The world would kind of melt away. And there would be this sort of deep engagement with the act. And that was life-changing for me, because at that point I was like, oh, okay, wow. So if someone else can find that space in another act, maybe I could find it in another act. Maybe it could open doors for me. And so I started just to be inquisitive about it. And I kind of thought, oh, what is it? And, have other people written about it? And I came across lots of literature around what Csikszentmihalyi had written about his research around the flow state back in the 60s and the 70s, and where, he had studied happiness and why do people do what they do, and why does a painter paint for days, and then as soon as they finish they put the painting in the back of the cupboard and never look at it again. Why do people risk their lives in action sports only to spend 30 seconds giving each other a high five and then and then moving on. And it just kind of captivated my imagination. And so then I started to look at, okay, well, how can I find flow? And for me, adventure sports and action sports were what my body could do physically. And I loved being in nature, and I kind of moved into a life of scuba diving and surfing and kite surfing and lots of other action sports over time. And then it captivated me so much that I wanted to study it. And I sort of started off, I guess, in the world of sports psychology and looking at flow from a performance basis. You know, why do some moments we choke and then suddenly the next moment we're our magical best self, or vice versa? And how come sometimes there's just this internal harmony and fluidity to our movement, and other times there's just this anxiety or distraction or conflict? And that kind of led me into a wider study of flow in terms of philosophy and how do we approach life, and what does that mean for anxiety, people with anxiety and stress, and how can flow be integrated to improve life satisfaction? And I've been writing and talking about flow ever since, and now run an organization that dedicates itself to coaching, training, and researching flow and developing flow coaches. So hopefully that gives a background.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's perfect. What would you say to someone who doesn't really like resonate with the idea of flow, and maybe doesn't feel like they have found it very much, or feel like they identify with like some of the narratives around flow as being like, you know, like being in adventure sports or doing crazy stuff or something like that? What would you say to someone who's maybe like a bit skeptical of the idea of flow, or the idea that they could access flow?
I would probably bring them back to the idea of subjective experience. You know, like flow is a subjective experience like happiness is. And we can often, or love, right? We can feel happy and we can feel love, but we can also be very skeptical about, well, what actually is love and what actually is happiness, and does it even exist? And, you know, what are these things? What is it? And when we start to look at a subjective experience through the lens of our experience, as opposed to through the lens of our logical, critical brain, we start to have a greater connection and value around subjective experience. Often is the case. And, you know, I often like to help, or I think it's very helpful for people to recognize how flow shows up in their day-to-day. You know, most people will experience flow daily. You know, often we might put it up in this sort of peak performance, magical moment, once in a lifetime experience that, if we're lucky enough or elite enough, we'll get to and we'll remember for a lifetime. But when we look at flow as being this sort of amazing internal sense of congruency, cohesion, effortlessness, absorption, we start to realize that, okay, we experience aspects of flow all the time. And maybe sometimes we experience flow without even realizing it. You know, so for example, when we're writing an email and the email just kind of writes itself, and we're like, perfect, awesome. That would have been a very mild moment of flow. Or we're in a social situation and we tell a joke. We weren't expecting ourselves. We didn't plan to tell a joke. It just fell out. And when we start to recognize these mini moments, or when we start to see them in others, you know, kids are great at being in flow. And when we start to see this subjective experience around us, we start to recognize it more and identify it more. And I think a lot of people might be somewhat skeptical as to, can I find flow? Because some of the literature they might have read around it is all very elite, and it's only for people at the very peak of their game. And that's there's certainly a narrative there that is important and valuable, in the sense that the more highly trained we are, the more skill we have, the more complex situations we can kind of engage with, so the greater the difficulty or the greater the challenge, and the higher the challenge and the higher our skill level, the greater complexity that there is. And so that complexity, the greater complexity, requires more and more absorption and less distraction, less conflict. So we might experience more intense moments of flow at the high levels of mastery that we have over a particular task. But flow is certainly not reserved for those deep, complex tasks.
Nice. That's great. How much do you think better accessing flow is about noticing it more?
Important, but not everything. Like, I think, like anything, when we set an intention, or when you've been buying shoes and then suddenly you walk down the street and you recognize what shoes everyone's wearing. When we put something into our awareness, it seems to come up all around us. So I think that's an important part of it, because ordinary, we label flow as luck, right? Or the ego takes control and we go, oh, no, I'm amazing, look at me. Or we just get confused and we quickly move past it. And we often don't label flow as this thing, right? As this subjective experience. We might label excitement. We might label being sad or angry, but we often don't label being in flow. And when we do start to label it, that creates natural organic signposts in the brain to kind of go, oh, it's the thing. Maybe it feels great. Maybe I want more of it. So the brain will naturally start to orientate itself towards it and start to sort of find situations, that have a flow ability about them. And, the brain, there's a lot of literature around the kind of psychological selection of flow, and in terms of how inbuilt it is into individual preferences and actions and societal formations and so forth, in the sense that there's a sense of the more flow is so intrinsically rewarding. It feels so great. We come alive. We utilize our skills and our strengths, and that we naturally want it, and we naturally get attracted to sports or situations in which we feel that we can find it. And that's why some people fall in love with football, some people fall in love with painting, some people fall in love with rock climbing. And we naturally move towards those spaces that allow us to find our flow.
Yeah. So I think that some people worry that the more they think about flow and the more they try to find it, and the more they try to kind of strategize around it, that they're more likely to miss it, or to be distracted, or to actually have there be more anxiety. And this feeds into a little bit about what you said around, like, people think flow is luck. And I've heard so many athletes say to me, like, oh, flow's not something you can find. It's not something you can look for. It's something you need to grab when it's there. What would you say to that kind of reasoning around flow?
I would say it's a shame and quite limiting for that individual. I think any human pursuit of subjective experience shows that the more we put it in our radar, the more likely we are to find it, both directly and subconsciously. And I think when we look at, like, what flow isn't, two things become really obvious. The first is distraction, and the second is conflict. And you could argue that they're one and the same thing. But when there's some kind of conflict internally or externally, or some kind of distraction internally or externally, then flow doesn't exist, because we've lost that absorption, we've lost that effortlessness. Our brain's busy distributing attentional nodes in order to overcome that conflict or distraction. And often when people first try to find flow, it becomes a distraction, very much becomes this sort of, it replaces whatever they were obsessing about previously. Ordinarily, it's like the outcome. I need to get to the top. I mustn't fall. I need to, and our mind gets consumed about that and what other people are doing and how we look alike on the wall, or what people will think of us if we're. And it's all kind of based on this sort of underpinning notion of it's an ego-orientated approach towards a task, which the brain naturally does, but around that kind of outcome-orientated process, and which causes us to, as soon as we have an outcome, we have expectation. As soon as we have expectation, we start to compare. As soon as we start to compare, we start to get a little bit anxious. As soon as we get anxious, a little bit of self-doubt comes in, and stress and pressure becomes a problem, and so forth. And there's this, for most people, when we put flow as the true north, or we say, okay, right, I'm going to climb now to find my flow. Often that has just replaced the outcomes. Instead of I'm going to climb now to not fall off or get to the top, I'm now climbing to find flow. And if we don't find flow, that's going to be a major problem. And so it becomes this sort of prefrontal cortex logical outcome goal, and then it is a distraction. And then I would agree with what you suggested those people are thinking. However, if flow becomes more of a notion, right, an intention of, why am I here in the first place? Like, am I doing this activity because I love the experience? And am I doing this activity because I want to grow and develop and become a more optimal version of myself? Am I doing this activity because those moments in which everything clicks together and comes together, it just feels freaking awesome? If that becomes the notion and the direction of why we're doing what we're doing, then we kind of set the foundations of inner alignment. We kind of set that kind of mindset and framework for us to prime ourselves to get into flow. So I think that kind of more, there's sort of notion, intention, and then kind of conscious goal setting, if you like, and then moment to moment focus. And if flow is in that moment to moment focus, or that kind of more goal setting scenario, then it can become very distracting and a conflict if we don't arise it. But if we sit with it in a more of a sort of I call it a flow mindset or a flow approach. If we sit with it in that kind of, my approach here is I'm engaging to find flow, then it becomes super helpful. When we're in an activity in climbing, we just want to be focused on the rock, moment to moment, present, dealing with what's in front of us. We don't want to be thinking about flow. We don't want to be thinking about the outcome.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So it's really kind of about prioritizing the experience, the moment to moment experience, rather than thinking of flow as something that hasn't happened yet, if you know what I mean, like thinking about it as this future state, rather than I'm about to do something for the presence of it and for the moment to moment value of it, rather than what it might give me in the end. Do you want to say anything more about that, or I'll move on?
I also think it's important to set up the situation for play. Like if we take a different concept, a classroom or a workplace or a kitchen or whatever, if we just sort of hope to create good food or have productive employees, or we want kids or people to learn, and just wait for the moment that they're interested and then suddenly, captivate it, we lose so much other opportunity. But if we structure the classroom, the kitchen, or the workplace with things that help people become focused, become engaged, not get triggered to sort of outcome ego orientated ways of thinking. If we structure the challenge of the task in a way that's fun and difficult but achievable, then that's going to help. If we sort of structure the environment and the task and the challenge in a way that's highly motivating, then that's going to be really helpful for finding flow. And we won't ordinarily do those things if flow isn't a focus.
Yeah. So you at the Flow Center have like what you call a pathway to flow. Can you tell us, without going through like all the steps in detail, can you tell us a little bit more about its purpose and how you've used it to help people access flow?
Yeah, sure. So, one way of explaining it is this, we have our self-leadership. How do we lead ourselves? What's our approach? What's our mindset? This sort of underpinning, a little bit like what I was talking about. And we feel that there's a certain way to mold that that's really helpful to finding flow. And then a sort of a second, like we split it into three phases really. And then the second phase is more the kind of, okay, I'm about to climb, or I'm on the rock and I'm just chalking up my hands and getting ready. There's this sort of, okay, well, how do I manage my consciousness? How do I self-regulate myself in a way that's conducive to finding flow? And then lastly, okay, I'm in the moment, I'm ready to go. How do I let go? How do I kind of reach that total state of trust and allow intuitive action to occur? So that pathway is kind of designed, I guess, to work with, everyone's different, right? And some people have this amazing ability to trust themselves, but they just can't manage their thoughts. And as soon as the thought gets into their head, they can't like let it go. Other people, just don't have experience emotionally of managing their emotions or their attention, essentially. Attention, sort of encompasses thoughts, emotions, sensations, anything within our awareness or consciousness, if to use another term. So sometimes that needs work, but sometimes, our approach to the activity needs work. Why are we doing what are we doing? What's the reason behind our engagement here? And if there's conflict in those initial agendas, then at some stage that's going to become a barrier to flow. We'll either pop out of flow early or it will be a barrier to getting there. So in those sort of phases, there's generally some kind of conflict or distraction with people, and it happens all the time because we're human. We have a brain and an ego and desires, and so we're I've recently gotten back into tennis because I'm able to find relief for my injuries, and it's been incredible. But it's also been this process of going, oh my God, literally on every single point I need to reframe myself. I need to sort out my mindset, manage my moment-to-moment experience, and trust myself. So it's not something that we do once and it's done. It's like physical training. We don't just sort of get fit one day and then suddenly we're fit for the rest of our life. It's something that we need to integrate into how we do things and what we're doing.
Yeah, that's great. So how much do you think flow, if you were to help an individual find flow, how much of it is, as you said, like removing those distractions, and how much of it's actually teaching someone like positive action steps that might help them better access flow? So another way of thinking about that is like, how much of flow is actually about removing things that might be in your psychology, like removing distractions, and how much of it is about adding ideas, action steps, strategies, practices to what you're doing?
Yeah, really good question. And I think it depends on the person and the level of skill set that they come in to stuff with. I think mental training for some people is this completely new idea, right? And other people have been doing forms of mental training, whether it's mindfulness or visualization or emotional management or attention regulation for years. So they have a certain level of ability or skill level that they can utilize, because all of this stuff is transferable, right? It's all transferable in our relationships, in our work, in our play, and so it depends how, some people have never thought about flow as an experience, and so being able to that takes time, and that takes we need to add more strings to our bow. We need to add more arrows to our quiver. In that sense, we need to raise our level of awareness and tools. And a lot of it is also getting out of our own way. Like if we've trained to do a particular move once, then our body has a neurological blueprint of how to do that. So there's no reason from a physiological or neurological perspective why we can't repeat that and do that again. And so often what's stopping us is ourselves, our own thoughts or our own barriers, or and so a lot of it is, once we've acquired the skills, then stripping back. I tend to come in, generally speaking, with very elite athletes, and it's mostly stripping back stuff, and then giving them one or two things, but they've developed a whole suite of skills over their last 10 years or so. So it really depends on where people are at with their journey, but it's a really nice, I like the question, because it's a really nice way to think about, well, for me, do I actually need to let go of stuff and take stuff away and get out of my own way, or do I actually need to upskill and learn things here because maybe I've never been taught? Most of us go through life and school never really taught how to manage our thoughts or our brain, or how to evoke and sustain subjective experiences that we want in our life. We often get to a traffic light that's red and go, oh, I'm late. And that takes over our whole experience, and it manages us. Most of us aren't taught how to manage ourselves in that situation. So sometimes it's really important to level up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You've mentioned a few times this idea of getting in your own way. What are some of the most common internal distractions that you see that prevent people from accessing flow? And maybe just go into a bit more depth around what that actually looks like.
God, how long have we got?
Okay, maybe what about we focus on, say, the ego, or
okay.
there's more external ideas that the ego loves, and how that can be distracting. So in climbing, it's really nice for the ego to be able to come away at the end of the day and say, I did this climb, or I flashed this, or I did this quicker than someone else, or the egoic part of us just loves that, right? We love numbers and getting to the top and succeeding and all of that. But then it's also really fearful of not getting those things. And that can obviously be a huge distraction. So maybe you could tell us how some of the stuff that you that's within the pathway or within the the coaching work that you do might help someone like that remove that as a distraction.
Yeah, I mean, as we're all complex human beings, I think, and the only people who aren't complex are the people we don't know well enough, and we've all got intricacies from our childhood and our upbringing, and we've all got just different agendas as to when our ego pops up and when it doesn't. And for some people that have had trauma in the past, our ego has and probably more our super ego rather than our ego. And I guess a way I like to simplify these vague concepts is the me and the I. You know, we have this volitional sense of I, but then there's also this me. What do people think of me? What do, you know, this sort of projected self-image that we have of ourselves. And all that volitional I stuff is really helpful. And often all the me related thoughts are not helpful. And the me is more kind of like super ego sort of related stuff. And
Is that like the PR version of yourself?
Yeah, it's the part that we want other people to think that we are, you know, rather than the part that we actually are. And for some people, we get so lost in it, some people become that and they don't know any different, right? And you know, the Instagram profile is the kind of the epitome of it, I guess, for a lot of people. So, you know, there's this sort of you know, if we think of flow happens, or a major theme of flow is that there's this like just implicit trust. You know, we see something and we do it, and we have this sort of magical, I call it magical because it feels like it's not actually magical, but there's this sort of just amazing trust that we have with ourselves. And sometimes that doesn't come because there's a lack of self-confidence, there's a lack of self-belief, you know, and some of that comes from the narrative that the story that we have about ourselves. We always put ourselves down, or we're unforgiving, or we're discompassionate, or we feel safe in a fear-driven story about the situation, or we've used fear to motivate us. And therefore we can't let go of fear, because if we do, we'll let go of the motivation that's driven us to get there. And you know, so sometimes the ego will be strong in that inability to really let go and trust ourselves. You know, that's a sort of a common one. And then, you know, you talked about outcomes and focusing on things that aren't necessarily helpful, you know, and goal setting is like this massive area of like disaster zone, right? Where in some ways it can be really helpful, and it's, you know, structures our attention, it gives us a focus, it gives us stepping stones. But in other ways it can be really dangerous in that we become attached to the goal. And instead of it being a signpost of this is where I want to go, it becomes this like destination of I have to get here. And then as soon as we become sort of attached to that causes conflict and distraction and stress and that kind of escalation of anti-flow begins. You know, so those are typically the common ones. You know, in athletes, there's this sort of perfectionism that often exists, and sometimes a sort of a level of selfishness or narcissisticness that has allowed them to get to where they've got, but then they struggle to sort of let go and trust. And you know, sometimes, you know, that can show up a lot in more sort of elite athletes. And you know, for the everyday person, often it's a case of in flow, you know, another character of flow is that there's just this intuitive action. You know, we don't think and then do, we just kind of intuitively know what's right and we let it happen. And for a lot of people, we've lost contact with intuition. We've lost contact with how is my intuitive voice different from my thinking voice, different from my heart space voice, different from my instinct. And we kind of lump them all in together most of the time and just sort of think that that's what we should do. But often we're sort of enslaved to our thinking brain, or to our sort of beliefs or emotions and feelings, or enslaved to our instinct in a risky situation. And we never have the space to sort of move or act from our intuition. And I think, you know, a lot of the work at a more deeper level is sort of stripping back stuff to allow people to then build a new relationship with their intuition, and then strengthen that relationship so that when challenges or complexity comes, we can prioritize that intuitive voice over the other distractions that normally pop up.
Yeah, it's all really interesting. I, I found it interesting the way you framed the idea of not wanting to let go of fear, because that fear is actually what's driving us. And I feel like maybe with high level athletes, but I'm not sure. Certainly with some people I've worked with, it's like there's this resistance to letting go of those external motivators, even though they're fear based, because they're like, well, why would I get up in the morning if I'm not scared that I won't lose my fitness, or I'm not scared that some younger climber is gonna better me? And obviously, like, you know, we talk a lot about this at Strong Mind about building up those intrinsic motivators. But do you have anything more to add about that? Because I think that is something that's common, where even when someone realizes that they're being they have fear-based motivations, that they're like, well, what's actually wrong with that? Like, that's actually worked for me. And added to that, we also see that a lot in our role models. You know, we have tons of climbing films where it's clear that someone's being driven by those fear-based motivations, and you see that the only moment of relief and joy that they get is like when they finish their goal. You know, and it's all about, it will be great when I've done it, rather than it's great now. And I just wondered if you have anything more to add to that.
Yeah, and you know, it's a really important point you bring up. Fear drives most of what we do, as you know, for many humans, right? We're stuck in this sort of, I need to be, I need to have achieved, I need to look like, I need people to think of me. And it all comes, you know, ultimately from a fear of being abandoned, or a fear of not being liked, or fear of low self-worth, or all that sort of, you know, different from different people. You know, and I think we can achieve incredible things through fear. Will we be our optimal self through fear? Probably not. We can tick many boxes, we can do many things through fear. Fear is an amazing motivator. But can we get to our optimal state of functioning, where there's just this effortless movement? Highly unlikely. You know, you see, you know, a great example is like someone who's running away from the police, and it's like, I don't want to get arrested, I got to run. You know, bolt of fear allows us to suddenly, you know, scale a wall that we wouldn't have been able to, or a fence that we wouldn't have been able to scale normally, because that fear, you know, injects us with a level of sort of sympathetic activity, which allows us to kind of become present instantly, and it allows us to become alert and focused instantly, and it can help momentarily. But then if that sustains, that becomes tightness, and that becomes tension, and then that becomes rigidity, and then we lose that kind of initial spike of helpful, like physiological neurochemical helpfulness. And when we have fear as a motivator, then that sustained rigidity, and that sustained tension, and that sustained fatigue that comes from that becomes prominent. And then optimal function is almost impossible when we're trying to perform at 100% with a tank that's only got 60% in it. So, and I think what's difficult for a lot of people is that has worked in the past. It's got them off the couch. It's got them onto a route. It's got them to do something. But then I question, well, what if you had done that through other motives? How much better might have you have climbed? How much better would the route have felt? How much more joy might you have felt? And you talked about when fear's this motivator, we kind of do enough to get past it. And then we have this relief of, oh, thank God that's over. And that relief can feel pretty good. But ultimately, that whole experience has been pretty stressful. And then quickly the brain goes to, well, what next? But when we have more intrinsic drivers or flows at like a priority, and we're doing reasons for things of being our optimal self and having the richest subjective experience possible, then suddenly that whole process becomes joyful. And instead of feeling relief when we get to the top, we get this immense sense of gratitude and kind of joy and just the whole thing coming together, and privilege of this thing actually, us living such an amazing life that we're able to go climbing and reach the top. And it sustains itself, and we're able, and then that kind of embeds a bit more into who we are as a person, and it becomes more consolidated as to who we are in terms of our development, and then which consequently affects our decision making and all the rest of it. And one thing coming back to your previous question and linking it with this question, a common sort of issue that people seem to display and that I try to coach people out of is this idea of, it will be good, as you said earlier, Hazel, it will be good when, or, it will be great when I achieve flow, or, and we sort of look to, instead of, the opposite of that would be, I'm going to be my optimal self now. And now I'm going to move forwards. And I guess that's the difference, I guess, between sort of being flow and finding flow, and often, seeking flow as this sort of utopian high experience, which then becomes highly frustrating when we don't find it. And that, if we sort of endeavor to be our most optimal self in the moment, and then set up the conditions of having an optimal level of challenge and high motivating circumstances and less distraction, less conflict, and flow is just going to find us a lot.
Yeah, that's great. All right, it'd be good if we could open up to any questions that you guys might have. Do you want to just unmute yourself or raise your hand or put something in the chat? Is that someone? Oh yeah, Diana, do you want to go for it?
Hi.
Hey.
I hope you can hear me well, because I'm in a garden and my headphones don't work. But,
We've got you. Yeah, we can hear you well.
So I have a question for quite a while actually now, and it's great to be able to ask you directly. I have this question since the Flow conference of the Flow Center. And at that time I was working with youth athletes. So I was trying to find ways to help them focus and hopefully achieve flow. And it's really nice because it kind of also, now when you talk about it as the thing of flow not becoming the goal itself, the achievement itself. So I think it's slightly related to that as well. So on one of the lectures from the Flow conference, I got to a conclusion that you can develop certain steps that help you get into the flow. So there are certain things that kind of could put you in the focus and initiate the state of flow. But then ever since then, I've been kind of really thinking a lot of like, what is the difference between having the steps that help you get into the flow and these steps becoming a ritual that you're dependent on? So that basically then flow becomes the achievement you're seeking and you become dependent on these steps. So for example, it's funny that I also heard that there is a chalk being sold around with a specific smell, and they sell it as the smell will instigate the flow and get you into it, which I'm like, it's a great sales pitch. But then this exactly kind of relates to the question that I have, because people can be like, or like certain things they carry, you know, like I don't know, I need these specific shoes in order to send, and that's a ritual you're dependent on. But what is the difference between steps to get you into the flow and them becoming a thing you're really dependent on? So if you're not in a situation to do it, your mindset goes completely like off the trails. Kind of. I hope it's a clear question.
Yeah, and I think it's an awesome question. You know, there's so many, you know, I think naturally, like if no one knows about flow, but you're trying to achieve something, right? We naturally create these nuances, right? You know, whether it's someone going to work and we go to our favorite coffee shop and we do a certain thing before we open the computer and start working, or whether it's you know, I used to work with a ski jumper that used to tie their shoelaces 13 times before ski jumping, you know, and we all have these nuances, and I've developed them in the past, and like having to tap my back foot against the ground before I serve, and, you know, just sort of crazy little things that at some level we've persuaded ourselves that it's going to help us. And most of the time that's based from a fear-based perspective, right? It's based on this sort of, if I don't, you know, I won't be able to be my best. And all those rituals are sort of coping strategies to often distract us from that conflict that's stopping us finding flow, right? Or it puts us into a level of comfort and competence and ritual and habitual comfort that allows us to feel better or more in control, that we can then put into our performance. So most of those sort of natural rituals that we build up are sort of they're coping strategies. But I guess flow rituals, or rituals that we've designed because we know that they induce flow and we know that they are more likely to help us find flow, are sort of designed to help us trust ourselves more. And they're designed to allow us, you know, first of all, they're not based out of fear. You know, secondly, they're designed to help us trust ourselves more and to let go of that need to control. And so what experientially, you know, what I find happening at least, is that I become less dependent on them, and I actually don't use them a lot unless I need to. You know, it's suddenly like, oh, I've just recognized that I'm completely out of flow because I'm thinking about something negative. Okay, back to my flow ritual. And then I'll get into flow for a little bit, and whilst I'm in flow, I don't need to use any of the rituals because I'm engaging and I'm trusting. But these other rituals that we develop through fear tend to sort of, we need to do them all the time, you know, and it helps us to kind of feel in control. So I see them as two very different recipes, cooking two very different dishes, rather than being one and the same thing. Unless, of course, coming back to our very early conversation, if flow becomes this outcome that I have to hit, you know, then it's basically the same thing. Does that help, or does that sort of, how do you feel about that response?
Yeah, it helps a bit. I think also 2 days ago, I listened to the podcast with you and Hazel about making it happen versus letting it happen, or letting it happen versus making it happen. So for example, now when you say this, when I listen to you say this, I have in mind what Hazel said about focusing on a tiny piece of rock of the size of a penny when she notices she's distracted. So for example, that's kind of, I assume, it's a little thing that brings you back into the flow, and it's not a ritual that you depend on. Yeah. So it's not like I need to zoom in into a piece of rock in order to send, but more like if I'm distracted, I can do this to help me.
Exactly. Yeah. Like maybe it's better. Maybe the connotations of a ritual make you feel like you'd have to be dependent on it. Whereas if you think about those things as actually just tools you can use as and when you need them, then maybe you can think about it in a way that makes you feel like you would be less dependent on it. There's definitely tools that I use. And when I really want to do something, and like when the challenge level's high, I'll utilize those tools more than when I'm just out climbing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. I think partially my question was also due to it's hard to explain this kind of stuff to teenagers, right?
Cam, you've worked a lot with kids and teenagers. I wonder if you can chat about the differences there, because that's something I'm really not, I don't have much experience with at all.
Yeah, I mean, often it's about keeping things simpler. They don't have the cognitive sort of understanding, and they don't want the cognitive understanding. They just kind of want a quick fix, right? And they want it practical and mostly experiential. So, often I'll take younger kids, teenagers, I'll go play basketball with them, right? And we'll mimic a challenge or a performance setting within a game of one-on-one, which symbolizes everything that they have in their domain, whether they play basketball or not. But it's more of an experiential learning. And then we can I talk about this stuff that we've all been talking about, and in a way that's relative to how they're feeling right there and then, and where their focus is right there and then. And then it's very piecemeal and then do, piecemeal and then do, rather than like this chat has all been chatting and theory and that kind of stuff. So I think the delivery is super important. As soon as it gets too heady, then often that engagement is lost. Yeah, and I think we all set ourselves up anyway, but some of us set ourselves up for success, and most of us set ourselves up for failure, in the sense that I'm either using tools that I know help, or I'm using tools sort of unconsciously that are not helping. Most of the time we think they might be helping, but actually they're not helping. And I think in that younger years, it's really helpful for them to understand that they are not their thoughts, they are not their behavior. When we grow up, we kind of, the world is the world, right? And then we slowly, as we get older, we kind of realize, oh, I'm not the world, I've actually got a name, and I'm this individual, and I'm separate from another person. And we go up more and we kind of realize that, oh, people have different perspectives. And it's not until we get quite old until we realize that, oh my God, I have all these thoughts in my head, but I don't need to take any of them seriously. They're just things in my head, like a popcorn machine's designed to make popcorn. Doesn't mean I need to eat every single piece of popcorn, right? We can select one and choose another, and we don't get to that level of diffusion from everything that's going on inside us. And so for kids to kind of understand that they can have a thought, or they can have a bit of anxiety or a bit of fear, and they don't have to listen to it. They can just laugh at it and let it go. Often they're way more capable at actually letting go than adults. So hopefully I'm kind of giving you a few practical things as well as conceptual things to help them find. But I find working with their experience and kind of going, okay, you tell me the last time you climbed when it just felt everything came together, and you weren't thinking about what other people were thinking, and you were just on that rock, and you were moving, and you felt really confident. And then they kind of go, oh yeah, I've got a time. And can you give me a specific time? Can you give me like, a move that you did? Where were you? What happened? So they kind of regress, and then work with the experience of it. Okay, so how, where's that feeling in your body? It's kind of kind of, my upper chest. Okay, great. Let's expand that feeling a bit more. What does it look like? What's the color of it? Is it moving? Is it static? Is it green? Is it blue? Is it heavy? Is it light? Oh, it's this light green, wavy water that's in the top of my chest. Okay, great. Now, let's allow that to grow. Let's move it up and down the spine. Let's move it through the arms. Let's sort of embodiment of that neurological experience. And then they feel great, right? And then we can kind of pressure test it. Okay. So is there a climb that you're really stressed about? Oh yeah, this is one climb. Okay. Let's spend 30 seconds bringing back that light green water into our body. And now think about doing the climb. How do you feel about it? Oh, I'm really excited. I can't wait to go. So they may not need all the cognition around it, but they working with the experience of flow and how that can become a priority for them, and how that they can then, in that example I've just given, use that green water, and for them, it could be nothing about flow. It could be that they want to feel that green wavy water in their body again. So working with meeting, and each child is different depending on where they're at in terms of their intellect and stuff. But I think the really important thing is meeting the children where they're at, keeping it very simple, keeping it very practical, and that can often help.
That makes a lot of sense. Great stuff. Really nice. So thank you.
Oh, pleasure.
Veronica, do you want to go?
Yeah, thanks for the talk already. You mentioned that you were getting back into tennis, and that like every time, or you have to like reposition yourself for flow, like all the time during a session, I guess, maybe between the serves, for example. I'm just like wondering what that looks like for you, because it's a bit different from climbing, and I play volleyball, and then you have like that. You serve, there's something going on, and then you have a break, and then you start again and again and again, which is, yeah, quite different from climbing, I think, where you start climbing, and then you climb, and then you're done, sort of. Yeah, but what does it look like for you? How do you sort of like position yourself again and again for flow, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, I use the pathway that I was talking about earlier. First of all, I look at my intention. Is my intention to win the point, or is my intention to find flow in this point? Yes, I want to win the point, but so I always connect with that, and then suddenly that takes away all the stress of needing to win, or what other people might be thinking of me if I lose the point, or I'm 40-15 up. If I lose the game, I'm going to look like a complete twat. All that sort of stuff disappears, right? And then I kind of go to that more self-regulatory place of being present, and I heighten my senses, and I just sort of I personally go into sort of like a bit of a trance state. So I activate my peripheral vision, because that's where we operate in flow. We're not conscious and consciously focusing. We're having this peripheral vision directly connected to our motor cortex, bypassing all this kind of critical self-doubt and all that kind of stuff. So that's a sort of a way to kind of bypass that overactive thinking brain. And then I sort of allow myself to completely trust myself. I don't try and control my return. I don't try to control my serve. I might give myself a vision of sort of, where I want the ball to end up, or the arc of what it might look like. But then when I go to hit it, I don't try and control any aspect of it, and that kind of self-leadership, self-regulation, self-actualization, if you like, those sort of 3 steps. I kind of, coming back to the previous conversation around kids, there's this sort of, the phrase I use is like ready, steady, flow, as if we're like ready, steady, go. Am I ready? Okay, I'm ready. Am I steady? And now flow time. So that's the kind of, I only use it when I know I'm out of it, but just using that sequence really helps me to become really present. and committed to each shot. Full point.
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Well, unless anyone's got any burning questions, maybe we can leave it there because we've gone over a little bit. You got time, Cam, for the last question if anyone's got one? No worries if anyone doesn't. You good? Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Cam. That was great. So many amazing nuggets in that conversation, for sure, that I think people get a lot out of. So thanks a lot for that. And thanks for those of you who could come live. And thanks for watching, anyone who's watching later. It's been great. Thanks a lot.